I found my grandson in a state group home 10 years after he was born. And until that moment, I didn't even know he existed. I remember standing there in the hallway, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the air, my hand trembling against the cold metal railing as I watched him through the half-open door. A boy with my son's eyes sitting quietly by the window, rocking ever so slightly, as if the world had taught him to stay small and unnoticed, and in that instant something inside me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a slow, quiet way that felt far more permanent than any scream could ever be. Because no grandmother should have to meet her own blood like a stranger, no child should grow up believing they were never wanted, and yet there I was, 68 years old, realizing that for more than a decade, a piece of my family had been hidden from me like a shameful secret, like something that didn't deserve to be spoken out loud. And the worst part wasn't just that my grandson had been abandoned, it was that my own son, the boy I had raised, the boy whose fevers I had stayed up all night to soothe, whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose future I had once believed in with everything I had been the one to walk away from him, to decide that his own child was too different to belong. And I didn't learn any of this all at once, it didn't come crashing down in a single moment of truth. No, it started with something small, something so ordinary I almost missed it. A simple Sunday dinner at my son Daniel's house, the kind of evening that should have felt warm and familiar, the kind of evening where the biggest concern is whether the roast is overcooked or the wine has breathed long enough. I remember Rebecca setting the table with that careful precision she always had, her smile polite but never quite reaching her eyes, and Daniel scrolling through his phone between bites, barely looking up, the conversation thin, stretched like something fragile that might snap if pressed too hard. And then without warning he said it, just a passing comment, the kind of thing you'd forget 5 minutes later if you weren't paying attention. Some kids just aren't meant for this world, he muttered, almost to himself, and I felt it then, a strange tightening in my chest, like a door somewhere deep inside me had creaked open. I asked him what he meant, of course I did, but he waved it off with a shrug, said it was nothing, just something he'd read online, and Rebecca laughed softly, too quickly, her fingers tightening around her glass before she took a long sip, avoiding my eyes. And maybe I should have let it go. Maybe a different version of me would have smiled, changed the subject, pretended everything was fine. But there was something in the way they looked at each other, something unspoken that hung heavy in the air, and for the first time in years, I realized I didn't really know my own son anymore, that there were parts of his life he had carefully kept out of reach, hidden behind polite conversations and infrequent visits. And that night as I drove home alone, the streetlights blurring past my windshield, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just brushed against the edge of something much darker than I was ready to face, something that had been buried for years, waiting for the right moment to surface, and I had no idea then just how far I would have to go to uncover the truth, or how much it would change everything I thought I knew about my family. I did not sleep that night, not really. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching the faint shadows of passing headlights slide across the walls, replaying that single sentence over and over in my mind. Some kids just are not meant for this world. It sounded careless at first, like something you might scroll past online, but it did not feel careless when it came from my son. It felt deliberate, like a truth that had slipped out by accident, and the more I thought about it, the more it began to settle into something heavier, something that refused to be ignored. I had spent years convincing myself that the distance between Daniel and me was just part of life, that children grow up, get busy, build their own families, but now I wondered if that distance had been carefully constructed, if there were entire chapters of his life that had been intentionally kept out of reach. I got out of bed just before dawn, made myself a cup of coffee I did not drink, and sat at my small kitchen table with my hands wrapped around the mug, waiting for a clarity that did not come. Instead there was only that quiet, persistent feeling that something was wrong, something that had been wrong for a very long time. The next morning I called Daniel. I kept my voice light, casual, the way mothers learn to do when they sense resistance. I asked about dinner, about work, about Rebecca, and then as gently as I could, I asked him what he had meant the night before. There was a pause on the other end, not long but long enough. He let out a short laugh and said I was overthinking things, that it had just been something he read, nothing more. His tone was easy, practiced, but it did not match the silence that followed, the kind of silence that feels like a door closing. I could hear Rebecca in the background, her voice low, asking who he was talking to, and then everything went quiet, too quiet, as if the air itself had tightened. I said goodbye shortly after that, thanked him for dinner, told him I would see him soon, but when I hung up, I knew I would not be able to let it go, not this time. Not after the way Rebecca had avoided my eyes. Not after the way Daniel had dismissed it so quickly. There are moments in life when you realize you have been looking in the wrong direction for years, and this felt like one of them. I spent the rest of the morning going through old photographs, not because I expected to find anything, but because I needed to ground myself in something real. There was Daniel as a little boy, standing in our backyard with grass stains on his jeans. There was his high school graduation, his wedding day, Rebecca smiling beside him in that perfect white dress. Everything looked so normal, so carefully preserved, and yet there was something missing, something I could not name at first. It was not until I reached the more recent years that I noticed it. The absence, no baby pictures, no announcements, no holidays with a stroller in the corner or toys scattered across the floor. Nothing that suggested a child had ever been part of their lives, and maybe that should not have surprised me. They had always said they were too busy, that they wanted to wait, but now that absence felt different. It felt intentional, like something had been erased rather than never existing. I set the photographs aside and reached for my phone. This time I did not call Daniel. I called the only person I could think of who might speak without filtering every word. My sister Helen. She had always been more observant than I was, the kind of person who noticed the things others missed. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm, familiar, and for a moment I almost lost my nerve, almost told her it was nothing, that I just wanted to chat. But instead I asked her a simple question, one that made my own heart beat faster just saying it out loud. I asked her if she had ever heard Daniel mention a child. There was a pause, longer this time, heavier, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed, not dramatically, but enough for me to feel it, enough to know that whatever she was about to say would not bring me comfort. She told me she thought I already knew, and in that moment, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the morning light spilling in through the window, I realized that I had been the only one left in the dark. Helen did not speak right away, and in that silence I could hear everything she was not saying, the careful way she was choosing her words, the hesitation that only comes when someone realizes they are about to cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. I tightened my grip on the phone and asked her again, slower this time, as if repeating the question might somehow soften whatever answer was coming, and when she finally exhaled, it sounded like she had been holding that breath for years. She told me there had been rumors, nothing anyone ever said directly to me, but enough quiet conversations, enough sideways glances at family gatherings to make her wonder if something had been hidden. She said she had once overheard Daniel and Rebecca arguing at a holiday dinner. Not loudly, not enough to draw attention, but just enough for certain words to slip through, words like facility and special care, and it was the right decision. And at the time she had assumed it was about someone else, a distant relative perhaps, someone we barely knew. But now she was not so sure. I felt a chill move through me, slow and steady, the kind that starts deep inside and spreads outward until even your hands feel cold. I asked her why she had never told me, and she hesitated again, softer this time, almost apologetic. She said she thought I already knew, that it had seemed impossible that something like that could happen without a mother being involved, and that was when it truly settled in, not just the possibility that there had been a child, but the certainty that I had been deliberately excluded, that decisions had been made, life-altering decisions, without me even being considered. I thanked her, though I do not remember exactly what I said, and after we hung up I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, letting the pieces begin to arrange themselves into something that felt both unreal and undeniable. The word facility lingered in my mind, heavy and vague. It suggested something official, something documented, not a temporary situation, not a misunderstanding, but a choice, a placement, and I realized then that if there had been a child, there would be records, there would be traces left behind no matter how carefully they had tried to hide them. That afternoon I drove across town to the public library, a place I had not visited in years. It felt oddly comforting in its quiet familiarity, rows of books, the soft hum of computers, people minding their own business, unaware that my entire understanding of my family was beginning to shift. I sat down at one of the computers and stared at the screen for a moment, unsure where to begin. Then I typed Daniel's name, Rebecca's name, searched for anything that might connect them to a hospital, a birth record, a legal filing. At first there was nothing, just the usual social media profiles, business listings, photographs of a life that looked polished and complete. But I kept going, refining the search, adding dates, narrowing the window to the year shortly after their wedding, and then I saw it, a small entry buried among public records, something most people would scroll past without a second thought. A notice of birth followed by a corresponding document filed just weeks later. The language was formal, clinical, but the meaning was clear enough once I read it twice. then 3 times a child had been born under their names, and shortly after custody had been relinquished, my hands froze over the keyboard, the words blurring for a moment before coming back into focus. I did not feel shock in the way I expected. There was no sudden rush of emotion, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet, steady realization that everything I had begun to suspect was true, that somewhere out there was a child connected to me by blood, a child who had been given up without a single word reaching me. I printed the document, the paper warm as it slid from the machine, and held it carefully, as if it might disappear if I moved too quickly. The date told me everything I needed to know. This had happened years ago, not recently, not in a moment of crisis, but long enough for it to have been forgotten by everyone except the one person who had never even known. I folded the paper and placed it in my bag, stood up, and walked out of the library into the late afternoon light. The world outside looked exactly the same as it had that morning, cars passing by, people going about their day, but for me, something had shifted completely. I no longer felt like I was searching for answers. I felt like I was following a path that had been hidden in plain sight. And for the first time, I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I did not go home right away. Instead, I sat in my car in the library parking lot with the engine off, the paper resting on my lap, and for a long time I just looked at it without reading it again, as if staring long enough might change what it said. But it did not change. The date stayed the same, the name stayed the same, and the quiet certainty that this had been hidden from me only grew heavier. I thought about calling Daniel right then, confronting him with what I had found, demanding an explanation, but something stopped me, something quieter and more deliberate, because I knew if I asked too soon, he would deny it, or worse, he would explain it away in a way that made it sound reasonable. And I needed more than explanations. I needed the truth, the kind that could not be softened or reshaped. So I drove instead, not toward my home, but toward the address listed on the document. It was an administrative office tied to child services, a plain building set back from the road, the kind of place you might pass 100 times without ever noticing. The parking lot was half full, the sky above it pale and steady, and I sat there for a moment before stepping out of the car, smoothing my coat as if I were about to attend something formal, something important, because in a way I was inside. The air was cool and still. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, the kind that did not ask questions, and I told her I was looking for information about a case. I kept my voice calm, steady, even though my hands felt anything but. She asked for identification, for a reason, for a connection, and I gave her what I could without revealing too much, just enough to open the door a little further. She disappeared into a back office and returned several minutes later with a form, something to request access to records, something that would take time, days perhaps, maybe longer, and I nodded, thanked her, filled it out carefully, each letter deliberate, as if writing it correctly might somehow speed the process along. But when I handed it back, I knew I would have to wait, and waiting has never been easy when the truth is this close. So I left, but I did not go far. I drove around the block once, twice, then pulled into a small diner across the street, the kind with vinyl booths and a menu that has not changed in decades. I ordered coffee I did not want, sat by the window and watched the building, not because I expected something to happen, but because I needed to stay close to it, as if distance might somehow make it less real. And as I sat there, I began to think back, not just to recent years but further, to moments I had not questioned at the time, small things that had seemed insignificant, Daniel canceling visits without explanation, Rebecca always steering conversations away from anything personal, the way they had avoided certain topics with a practiced ease that now felt less like coincidence and more like intention. I remembered one Christmas in particular years ago, when they had arrived late, both of them looking tired, distracted. Rebecca barely touched her food. Daniel kept checking his phone, and when I had asked if everything was all right, they had exchanged a look before answering, the kind of look that passes quickly but says more than words ever could. At the time I had let it go, told myself not to pry, but now that memory felt different, sharper, like a clue I had overlooked, and the more I thought about it, the more those small moments began to connect, forming a pattern that I could no longer ignore. This had not been a single decision made in haste. It had been something planned, something managed over time, something they had both agreed to keep from me, and that realization settled into me with a quiet weight, not explosive, not overwhelming, but steady and certain. I finished my coffee without tasting it, paid the bill, and stepped back outside. The late afternoon sun lower now, casting longer shadows across the pavement, and as I stood there looking at that building one last time, I understood something clearly for the first time since this all began. This was not just about finding out what had happened, it was about understanding why, and more importantly, it was about finding the child who had been left behind in all of this, because somewhere beyond paperwork and decisions and carefully kept secrets, there was a life that had continued without me, and I was no longer willing to pretend it did not exist. The waiting should have slowed me down, should have forced me to sit still and let the process unfold the way it was meant to, but instead it sharpened something inside me, something that had been quiet for years. I began to move differently, to pay attention in ways I had not before, and the next morning I returned to that same building, not to rush the request but to observe, to listen, to see what I might have missed the day before. I sat again in the lobby, this time longer, watching the steady flow of people coming in and out, social workers with folders tucked under their arms, parents holding hands with children who clung a little too tightly, and others who walked in alone, shoulders tense, faces closed off, and I realized that this place held more stories than anyone could ever fully understand. Stories of decisions made quietly, of lives redirected without ceremony, and somewhere within all of that was the one I was searching for. I approached the front desk again, not with urgency, but with patience, asking simple questions, general ones, about how cases were handled, about timelines, about what happened to children after custody was relinquished. The receptionist answered politely, professionally, but carefully, always within the limits of what she could say. And I understood that I would not find the truth by asking directly, not yet, so I shifted. I listened more than I spoke, and it was in those moments, in the spaces between questions, that small details began to surface, references to partnerships with local care facilities, mentions of group homes for children who required additional support. Nothing specific, nothing I could point to, but enough to suggest a direction, enough to give shape to something that had previously been invisible. I left again, but this time I did not feel stalled. I felt guided, as if the path ahead, though still uncertain, had begun to reveal its outline. I spent the afternoon driving through the surrounding areas, noting the names of care centers, pulling over to look them up on my phone, reading what little information was publicly available. Most of it was vague, carefully worded, designed to reassure without revealing too much. But one name appeared more than once, mentioned in connection with long-term placements, a facility located just outside the city limits, set back from the main road, and as I read about it, something settled into place, not certainty but recognition, the kind that tells you this is where you should begin. I did not go there that day. Instead, I went home, sat at my kitchen table, and laid everything out in front of me, the printed document, my notes, the names I had written down, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to fully consider what I might find, not just the facts, not just confirmation, but the reality of a child who had lived without me, who had grown up in a system I had never even known he was part of, and I wondered what that meant for him, what kind of life he had been given, what kind of person he had become, and whether there would be anything in his eyes that would recognize me, even in the smallest way. I did not sleep much that night either, but it was different this time, less restless, more focused, as if my mind had accepted that there was no turning back from this, that whatever I found, I would have to face it fully. The next morning I woke early, dressed carefully, and drove out to the address I had found. The road narrowed as I left the main part of town, trees lining both sides, the buildings becoming fewer and farther between, until finally I saw it, set behind a wide stretch of lawn, a modest structure, not imposing, not hidden, just quietly present. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, taking in the stillness of the place. There were no signs of urgency, no outward indication of the lives inside, just a building, a routine, a system continuing as it always had. And I realized then that whatever answers I was about to find would not come in a dramatic moment. They would come slowly, in pieces, in conversations that required care and patience. And as I stepped out of the car and began walking toward the entrance, I felt something steady within me, not anger, not even sadness, but a quiet determination that had taken root and refused to let go, because this was no longer about what my son had done or what had been hidden from me. It was about the child who had lived through all of it, and I was finally close enough to begin finding him. The front door opened with a soft mechanical click when I pressed the buzzer, and for a moment I simply stood there, adjusting to the quiet that seemed to settle around the building. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but it was different from the outside world, slower, more contained, like everything inside moved at its own careful pace. A woman in her 40s greeted me at the reception desk, her expression kind but measured, the kind of kindness that comes from seeing too much and learning how to carry it gently. I introduced myself, not with everything, not with the full truth, but enough to begin. I said I was looking for information about a child who may have been placed there years ago, that I believed I had a family connection, She listened without interrupting, her eyes steady, and when I finished, she asked a few quiet questions, names, approximate dates, details that I answered as precisely as I could, and then she nodded slowly, as if something had begun to align in her mind. She did not confirm anything immediately, but she did not dismiss me either, and that alone felt like a step forward. She asked me to wait, gesturing toward a small seating area near the window, and I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, watching as she disappeared through a door behind the desk. The minutes passed differently in that room, not quickly, not slowly, just steadily, and as I waited, I noticed small things, drawings pinned to a bulletin board, a stack of books in the corner, the faint sound of someone laughing somewhere down the hall. It was not what I had imagined, not cold or clinical, but not quite warm either. It felt like a place that tried its best with what it had. After what felt like a long time, though it could not have been more than 15 minutes, the woman returned, this time accompanied by an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with a calm presence and a folder held loosely in his hand. He introduced himself as a supervisor, his voice even careful, and he asked if we could speak privately. I followed him into a small office, the door closing softly behind us, and he sat across from me, placing the folder on the desk but not opening it yet. He asked me again about my connection, and this time I told him more, not everything, but enough that he could understand why I was there, why this mattered. I told him about Daniel, about the document I had found, about the years that had passed without my knowledge, and as I spoke, I watched his expression shift, not dramatically, but in subtle ways, recognition perhaps, or confirmation of something he had already suspected. When I finished, he rested his hands on the folder and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. He said that cases like this were handled with care, that privacy was important, but that there were circumstances where information could be shared, especially when a direct family member came forward. And then, slowly, he opened the folder, not fully, just enough to glance at the contents, his eyes moving across the page as if verifying what he already knew. And then he looked up at me and nodded once, small but certain. He told me there had been a child placed through their network, not directly in this facility at first, but later transferred there for long-term support, a boy, he said, and my breath caught, not sharply, but enough that I felt it, enough that the room seemed to narrow slightly around that single word. He continued, explaining that the child had been identified early on as needing specialized care, that there had been concerns about development, about communication, things that required consistent support, and while he spoke in professional terms, I could hear what was underneath it, the reason that had been chosen, the justification that had been accepted. I asked him quietly why the parents had relinquished custody, and he paused, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing how to say it. He told me that the official reason cited was an inability to provide the necessary level of care, that the parents had expressed concern about their capacity to meet the child's needs long term, and as he said it, I felt something settle into place, not anger, not yet, but clarity, the kind that comes when you finally understand the decision that was made, not as an abstract idea, but as a real choice with real consequences. I nodded, though I was not sure what I was agreeing to, and then I asked the only question that mattered now. I asked if the child was still here. The man looked at me, his expression steady, and after a brief pause, he said yes, he is, and in that moment everything else faded into the background, the years, the questions, the silence, all of it narrowing down to a single point, a single truth, that the child I had been searching for, the one I had never even known existed, was not somewhere far away or lost beyond reach. He was here in this building just down the hall, living a life that had unfolded without me, and for the first time since this began, I felt something shift inside me, something that was no longer about discovery, but about what came next. For a moment I did not speak, I simply sat there looking at him, letting his words settle into something real, something I could hold on to, and when I finally found my voice, it came out quieter than I expected. I asked if I could see him, not immediately, not without permission, just to know if it was possible. The man did not answer right away. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands as if considering not just the request, but everything that came with it. He explained that introductions like this had to be handled carefully, that the child, the boy, had a routine, a structure that helped him feel safe, and any disruption, even one with the best intentions, needed to be approached with patience. I nodded, understanding more than he might have expected, because even without knowing this child, I already knew that his world had likely been shaped by consistency, by the absence of sudden changes, by the need for things to remain predictable. I told him I was not here to disrupt anything, that I did not expect to walk in and be recognized, that I only wanted the chance to see him, To know that he was real beyond paperwork and quiet conversations. The man studied me for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. He said there was a way that I could observe from a distance just briefly without interaction, without introducing myself, and though it was not what I had imagined, it was enough, more than enough for now. He stood and motioned for me to follow, and as I rose from the chair, I felt a steady weight in my chest, not fear, not exactly, but something close to it, something that comes when you are about to step into a moment you have unknowingly been moving toward for years. We walked down a quiet hallway, the floor polished, the walls lined with simple artwork, and the further we went, the more aware I became of every small sound, the distant hum of voices, the soft creak of a door opening somewhere ahead, until finally he stopped near a partially open doorway and turned to me, his expression gentle but firm. He said I could stand just to the side, that I should not step in, that the boy would not be told I was there, and I nodded again, my throat too tight to say anything more. I moved into position, just outside the line of sight, and then I looked. At first I saw only the room, a simple space with a window letting in soft afternoon light, a small table, a shelf with a few carefully arranged items, and then I saw him, sitting near the window, his posture slightly hunched, his attention focused on something in his hands, a small object he turned over and over with quiet concentration. He did not look up, not at first, and I found myself studying the details, the way he moved, the rhythm of his actions, the stillness that seemed to surround him even in motion. And then slowly he shifted just enough for the light to catch his face, and in that instant, something inside me stilled completely, because there it was, unmistakable, the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, echoes of someone I had known for a lifetime reflected back at me in a child I had never met. I did not step forward, I did not speak, I simply stood there, holding on to that moment as if it might slip away if I moved too quickly, and as I watched him, I felt a quiet understanding begin to take root, not about the decisions that had been made, not about the reasons that had been given, but about him, about the life he had been living, the small, contained world he had learned to navigate without expectation, without the kind of connection that should have been there from the beginning, and I realized then that whatever came next, whatever conversations would need to happen, whatever truths would have to be faced, none of it could be rushed, because this was not just about finding him, it was about learning how to reach him in a way that would not take anything away from the stability he had built for himself. The man beside me gave a slight motion, a quiet signal that it was time to step back, and I did reluctantly, my eyes lingering for one last second before I turned away. And as we walked back down the hallway, I did not feel the same uncertainty that had followed me into this place. Instead there was something steadier, something clearer, because now I knew not just that he existed but who he was, and that changed everything. When I stepped back into the office, the quiet felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just altered in a way I could not fully explain, as if seeing him had shifted something permanent inside me. The man closed the door gently behind us and gestured for me to sit again, and I did, though it felt strange to return to something as ordinary as a chair after a moment that had changed everything. For a few seconds neither of us spoke, and I realized he was giving me time to gather myself, to let the weight of what I had just seen settle into something steady, and when I finally looked up at him I asked his name, something I had not thought to ask before. He told me it was Robert, and I nodded, grounding myself in the simplicity of that exchange before moving forward. I asked him about the boy, not just the facts I had already been given, but the details that make a life, what he liked, how he spent his days, whether he spoke, whether he laughed. Robert answered carefully, but not vaguely. He told me the boy's name was Noah, and hearing it spoken out loud felt like something opening, like a door that had been closed for far too long. He explained that Noah had challenges with communication, that he did not always respond the way other children might, but that he had his own ways of expressing himself, small routines, patterns, preferences that shaped his world. He mentioned that Noah liked to sit by the window in the afternoons, that he found comfort in repetition, in objects he could hold and turn over in his hands, and as he spoke, I could see those details aligning with what I had just witnessed, the quiet focus, the contained movements, the stillness that was not empty but full in its own way. I listened without interrupting, absorbing each piece as if it were something fragile that needed to be handled with care. And then I asked the question that had been forming since I first saw Noah. I asked if he had anyone, not in the official sense, not in terms of paperwork, but in the everyday sense, someone who visited, someone who knew him beyond his file. Robert paused before answering, not because he did not understand the question, but because he understood it completely. He said that there had been occasional inquiries over the years, distant relatives perhaps, people trying to reconnect or confirm details. but nothing consistent, no one who had become a steady presence in Noah's life. And as he said it, I felt that same quiet shift again, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but certain, the kind that does not ask for permission. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. I told him that I wanted to be that presence, not all at once, not in a way that would disrupt anything, but gradually, carefully, in whatever way was best for Noah. Robert listened, his expression thoughtful. And then he explained that it would be a process, that there were steps, evaluations, approvals, not barriers but safeguards, and I understood that. I welcomed it even because this was not something to rush, not something to force into place simply because I had just discovered it. I asked what I needed to do, and he outlined it for me: the forms, the background checks, the meetings, the time it would take to build familiarity, to allow Noah to adjust, to ensure that any connection formed was stable, supportive, lasting. And as he spoke, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, because for the first time since this began, there was a path that did not feel hidden or uncertain. It was clear, structured, something I could follow step by step. I spent the next hour completing what I could, signing documents, answering questions, providing information about myself, my home, my life, things that suddenly felt more significant than they had ever been before. And when I finally stood to leave, Robert walked me back to the front. He told me they would be in touch soon, that the process would begin, and I thanked him not just for the information, but for the way he had handled everything, with care, with respect, with an understanding of what this meant beyond the paperwork. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, the lights softer, and I paused for a moment beside my car, looking back at the building, not as something distant or unknown, but as a place that now held a part of my life, a part one had not known existed until now. And as I stood there, I realized that finding Noah had not been the end of anything. It had been the beginning of something I would have to build slowly, deliberately, with patience and attention. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to think not just about what had been lost, but about what might still be possible. The drive home felt longer than it should have, not because of the distance, but because of what I carried with me now, not in my hands, not in a document or a form, but in the quiet certainty that my life had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I followed the familiar streets, the same turns I had made for years, yet everything felt slightly out of place, as if the world had not changed but my place within it had. When I pulled into my driveway, I did not get out right away. I sat there, with the engine idling, watching the late afternoon light settle across the front of my house, thinking about how many years had passed with me, believing I understood my family, believing that what I saw was complete, and how easily that belief had been maintained by silence. I turned off the engine and stepped inside. The house greeted me with the same stillness it always had, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt unfinished, like something had been missing all along and I had only just realized it. I set my bag down on the kitchen counter and moved through the room slowly, not looking for anything, just noticing the photographs on the walls, the small objects I had collected over the years, all the pieces of a life that now felt like it had been built around an absence I never knew existed. I stopped in the living room and looked at the framed picture of Daniel as a boy, his smile wide, his eyes bright with a kind of innocence that seemed almost impossible to connect to the man he had become. And I did not feel anger when I looked at it, not yet. What I felt was something quieter, something that asked questions instead of demanding answers. How had he come to that decision? How had he convinced himself it was the right one? How had he lived with it for all these years without ever speaking a word? I knew then that I would have to see him, not immediately, not in a way that would turn this into a confrontation driven by emotion, but deliberately, with the same care I had brought to everything else, because this was no longer about discovering what had happened. It was about understanding it fully and deciding what came next. I made myself a simple dinner that I barely touched, sat at the table with my thoughts arranged in a way that felt clearer than they had been in days. I knew what I needed to do. I needed to give the process time, to follow through with everything required to become part of Noah's life, and at the same time, I needed to prepare for the conversation that would eventually come with Daniel and Rebecca, not to accuse, not to argue, but to place the truth in front of them in a way that could not be dismissed or softened. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, not from restlessness, but from a sense of purpose that had taken hold. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and began to write, not a letter I intended to send, but something for myself, a way to organize everything I had learned, everything I had seen, every detail that mattered. I wrote Noah's name at the top of the page and paused for a moment, letting it settle, letting it become real in a way it never had been before, and then I wrote everything else beneath it: the date I found, the facility, the conversation with Robert, the way Noah had looked sitting by the window, each piece placed carefully, deliberately, not to build a case, but to build a truth that could not be ignored. When I finished, I set the pen down and read through it once slowly, and as I did, I realized something important. This was not just about what had been done wrong, it was about what could still be done right. The doorbell rang just as I folded the paper, the sound sharp in the quiet house. I stood up, walked to the door, and when I opened it, Daniel was standing there, his expression uncertain, as if he had been debating whether or not to come. For a brief moment we simply looked at each other, the distance between us filled with everything that had not been said, and then I stepped aside and let him in, not because I was ready for the conversation, but because I knew it was time for it to begin.